Everybody. This is the problem set portion of the class for Martin Luther King Day, 2023. I want to start out talking a little bit about problem sets. People did a good job in general. Problem sets are very useful for the class. The grading, I assign some weight to it, but I just give a 0, 1, 2, or 3, depending on whether it was, a 3 is essentially correct and a 2 is largely correct. And I save the zeros for homework not handed in. But it's a pretty important part of the class, so please do that. I'd like to be able to grade within Canvas and then post it back. With these problem sets, I tend to do a lot of scribbling and changing graphs and things like that. So I think what I'll do and what I've done in the past is to print out your submissions, write on them, and then give them back to you on Monday for the class. This week, I'll put them outside my door. They should be ready mid-afternoon today, Monday. So let's talk about one of the problem set problems, the last problem that is the toughest one. And it illustrates, I think, an important point for the class. These graphs, there are different levels of understanding this kind of microeconomics that we're trying to go over. One level is intuitive, and I think intuition carries you quite a ways for a lot of things. Think about the problems, professors get higher salaries. That's going to make college more expensive. It's going to raise tuition. Raising tuition is probably going to decrease the number of students. That you can kind of think through intuitively without any problem. But problems like the last problem, the cocoa farmers and the cocoa market, that requires difficult intuition, I would say. So going beyond the intuition, things can be learned either graphically or with math. And typically intermediate microeconomics is taught mathematically. We could do that, but I think the intuition, it's easiest to gain from graphs rather than math. So that's why I'm sticking to graphs. And for certain problems that may seem clunky to start with graphs and then trying to generate the answer from the graphs. But the more you become familiar with it, the more you understand that there are tools that are very helpful for understanding what the answer to a problem might be. So that's a plug for going with the idea that graphs are important. They're a little bit hard to grasp sometimes right off the bat. I think you've got it, and then all of a sudden you have to apply it. And I think this coca example is a good example of that. So we've got a market before the government steps in that's in some kind of equilibrium. We've got a demand coming from people who are demanding cocaine, and we've got suppliers, the farmers, who are quite willing to supply coca leaves to the market. So before the government comes in, we've got some sort of supply and demand situation. And as I said last week, the demand is just coming from this hypothetical experiment where you're asking all potential buyers in this market. Suppose the price were $20 a ton or $100 a ton, and the derived price for the products of coca leaves were priced accordingly. There would be a certain amount of, in this case, tons of coca demanded. If the price is low, if it's higher, it's going to be less. We typically draw these things in a generic fashion, 45 degrees or so. But pretty soon we're going to worry about whether in fact that kind of 45-degree angle is a reasonable one for this kind of market. You could argue in the case of cocoa products that demand is likely to be pretty insensitive to price, right? It's likely to be more vertical than this. If people are addicted to cocoa products, then they'll be fairly insensitive to prices, right? So that would generate more of a vertical demand curve. If there are a lot of substitutes available for what you can derive from cocoa leaves, that's going to flatten out the demand curve. So you can start out with a generic kind of 45 degrees, but then you need to think about, is that right? Is that reasonable? Supply curve, we really have no idea what that looks like other than the fact that it's likely to be upward sloping, right? If you ask farmers, suppose the price is very high, how many tons of cocoa leaves are you willing to supply? That is likely to, it's going to be more, higher price, more demand. But what's driving the upward slope here is, you know, suppose you're in equilibrium and doing whatever farming you were doing, and then a price increases, you want to produce more, if you were all set before and you want to do more, you're likely to bring more marginal land, marginally productive land into cultivation, which is going to lower yields. And so you're going to be supplying more, but you're going to need a higher price for the supply. So that's where you get the upward sloping supply curve. And we'll talk more about what goes into the demand curve slope, what goes into the supply curve slope later, but it's important at this point to realize it's two completely independent sets of things, right? The demand curve comes from people's preferences, it comes from their income, it comes from the availability of close substitutes. It depends on whether you're talking about demand in the next week or demand, you know, over the next 10 years, because the longer the time period, the more available substitutes are going to be. But that's all kinds of things that go into the shape of the demand curve. Supply curve is totally different. Supply curve is all about the price of land in this case. It's all about production technology. It's all about the wage of workers who would work this land, right? So it's a totally different set of things that goes into the supply curve and the demand curve. All right, so let's return to this problem now. We've got a market equilibrium before the government steps in, and the price is $500 per ton. And all of a sudden the government comes in and says, look, we're going to pay all farmers $550 a ton. And we'll buy up all your crops at $550. So the question is, what's going to happen? And I think what the government is expecting to happen, and this has happened in a number of countries, you come in with an offer that's above the market price, you're going to buy everything off the market, and there's going to be no more cocoa supplied to the private market. That makes sense? Until you start thinking about the kind of economics of it. And mainly what the, well, let's do the supply curve first. Government comes in $550. What's that going to mean for suppliers? Well, the supply curve tells you at different prices how much they're willing to supply. And at $550, this is the amount. Q550. That's the quantity, QS, we should say, maybe 550. That's the quantity that they're willing to supply. So the supply curve hasn't changed at all. they still have the same willingness to supply different amounts of cocoa depending on the price that they get. And we're just saying it used to be 500, it used to be this point in the supply curve. Now it's 550, now it's this point in the supply curve. So the amount that is going to be supplied is this higher amount, QS 550. So the supply curve doesn't change at all. What about the demand curve? For a demand curve to shift, it's going to have to be the case that the willingness of people in the market to pay, to buy different amounts depending on the price has changed in a fundamental way. With the government coming in, they're a new demander. That is going to change the demand curve, but not by shifting it, because there's really nothing happening down here. The consumers still have their same preferences. And it's not going to change anything up here because this is the amount of demand that would be forthcoming if the price were above 550, right? So the key here is that if there's a demand curve in the market and a price is offered at 550, which is above the market price, there's still a smaller amount, but still in this case, a decent amount of market demand from all the people that are willing to pay more than $550, right? So this part of the demand curve hasn't changed at all. What's changed, let's draw this as the new demand curve, which is the same as the old demand curve, above 550. But now the government is buying up all of the produce that farmers want to supply at $550. So the demand, in effect, becomes horizontal at this point, right? So people are willing to buy a lot if the price is below 550, but the price is going to be they're not going to be able to outcompete the government because the government's offering 550. So we've got this new demand curve that has this kink in it. And that demand curve is crossing the supply curve at this 550, right? In other words, all of the cocoa that's being farmed is going to be bought up, but it's not going to be bought up 100% by the government. In fact, you're going to have this amount, let's say PM for private market. This amount is going to go into the hands of the private market. And it's only this amount that goes to the government. This amount purchased by a black market or purchased by the private market. So the government is only partly successful. It did reduce private market consumption by the difference between where it started out, this Q star, and where the private market demand has ended up, QPM. But this amount is very small relative to the total private market demand that originally existed at Q star, right? So here's where, all right, I hope, wish this was a class so I could get some questions. But if you do have questions, just let me know. This is where the flatness or steepness of the demand curve matters a lot. Because imagine instead of this demand curve, imagine the demand curve were much flatter. All right, I hesitate to keep going and writing all this stuff in. So let me erase a little bit. And draw a demand curve that is more responsive to price. So the demand curve we're going to draw has to go through this original equilibrium. That's what the assumption is. But suppose it's much flatter and looks like that. Okay, so if you do the same kind of analysis, now the government comes in, offers the 550. You're still going to get this amount supplied to the market by the farmers. But now there's a much smaller portion of the private market demand that would be activated at a price higher than 550. So now we have all of this going to the government. And only this amount purchased by the private market. So now most of the supply is going to the government and a smaller fraction is going to the private market. So still not what the government had in mind, but you know, you can say it's a relative success because it really did reduce private demand by this whole amount, right? This difference between where you started out and where the private market is with the $550 offer. So the lesson, or a lesson, is that if you want to know, I mean, qualitatively, the impact is going to be more is going to be supplied to the market. Some of it's going to be bought up by the government. Some of it's going to be bought up by the private market because they're willing to pay more than $550. But how much those shares are is going to depend upon the slope of this demand curve. So there are empirical estimates of what demand looks like. Whether it's the elasticity is very small in absolute value or much larger. This is a highly responsive, therefore elastic demand curve. But if you think about the nature of addiction, it's likely that a demand curve for cocoa products is likely to be much steeper than what a flat demand curve like this looks like. So the economic analysis kind of puts all that together and advises the government, well, you can do this, but you're only going to buy up a fairly small amount of the market, and much of the private demand is going to remain